Okay, should we get the next one? There's a hand right at the back there.
Hi. I came a little late, so I missed most part of your presentation. But my question is simple. Why do you think your story or your presentation is actually relevant or important today? So that's my first question. I just also want to comment quickly, I won't be long. In terms of, the scenarios or what you've been describing now, don't you think most of, people who really participated in those arrangements had very minimal or very few choices? Don't you think perhaps circumstances or situation push them to those extremes? I do not know, but I'm just thinking aloud. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Moodie, for the presentation. And I think I'm also very lucky to have you as a supervisor. I've got a question for you, and it's got to do with Cornell's concept of hegemonic masculinity. And Cornell constructed hegemonic masculinity as the culturally dominant way of being a man. Now, in your presentation, you pointed, there's a lot of cultural variations that you identify in conceptions of masculinity. That violence is not one of them, you make very clear. So I'm just wondering, what would constitute a hegemonic masculinity? Because it seems to me that there's so many variations. So how do you come up with one culturally dominant way of being a man?
Thanks so much, Dunbar. It's absolutely fascinating and crucially important. And I think, highlighting that masculinity isn't fixed and it can change. Highlighting that masculinity isn't fixed and can change is something very important that we need to understand and how that changes in relation to femininity. But what I was mainly struck by was your final, your two conclusions. And the first one was, that masculinity can change. And the second one is that men build wage work into their psyche as men. And what really strikes me is the tenacity of this particular construction of masculinity, right? Being linked to not both providing for the family and linking it to wage work. And it seems that actually what's changed isn't so much the construction of masculinity, but the political economy that underpins the ability to achieve it. And so my question is for you, but also for Taban. In a context with the decimation of wage work, where a significant percentage, perhaps a majority of the South African male population are no longer able to access wage work, why is this construction of masculinity still so tenacious? Right? Why isn't it changing so that men can retain a sense of masculinity, and even within the context of this current political economy? And then the second question for Dunbar is, the one moment of change that you did speak about was the shift from a kind of social construction to a more biological understanding, which was still then linked to wage work. But what do you think underpinned that shift? What was that about? Because that can also give us some ideas about what can lead to notions of masculinity changing in the present.
Thanks, Melanie. And a comment from me, actually, a question, which just picks up on Melanie's last point, which is the idea that masculinity simply became a biological notion. I'm kind of wondering about that argument, because it seems to me everything else you say and everything that Asanda and Tabang are researching suggests that it's not just biological, that it's very much social, that it's constructed around work in various ways, for example, as well as maybe other things. So I'm wondering about that kind of conclusion. Dunbar.
Okay. Hegemonic masculinity, Tabang. There is no single hegemonic masculinity, Connell said. Hegemonic masculinity, by the way, is hegemonic means kind of taken for granted. So that hegemonic masculinity is a kind of taken for granted conception of what it is to be a man. And it's usually, because it comes from Gramsci, associated with power. So, and Connell argues there are different forms of hegemonic masculinity. There's the masculinity, what he calls protest masculinity, which is based on a series of interviews with guys who are kind of semi-employed, unemployed, semi-criminal, you know, thumbing their noses at the cops and so on. This is in Australia. And then there's the masculinity that's associated with the guys who join women in environmental movements and environmental centers, who don't quite know how to define their masculinity, because the hegemonic conception of masculinity is being defined by the feminist woman. And then there are people that Connell calls very straight gays. Guys who are inclined, whose preference is to have sex with other men, but who are struggling to deal with that in a world where even in Australia at this time you still have gay bashing expeditions down in certain areas of Sydney. So and then there's the men of reason, the mining engineer type of masculinity. So there are various kinds. So Connell says various kinds of hegemonic masculinity. So what's the kind that I've been talking about? And I've been talking about a shift. The shift from the social, from the definition of masculinity as involving care for the homestead, care for the umzi, to a biological conception of manhood, doesn't mean that the biological conception of manhood is also not social. We're not shifting here from the social to the biological. We're shifting from a social conception of manhood as involving presiding over a homestead to a social conception of manhood as involving a particular understanding of one's body. But you're right. It was a really good question. That shift. What does that shift signify in terms of our understandings of what it means, what it is to be a man? And I didn't, because I don't have a lot of material on the shift to sort of biological masculinity. It's less easy for me to talk about that, except for those young guys who that we interviewed in Manhood, who definitely understand. They understand masculinity biologically. They are still sending money home from the mines. They're not farming anymore. They're building their houses closer to the road. They're building flats, which means they're building rectangular houses with flat roofs rather than the rondavel type, which is more typical. So there's definitely a kind of a shift, I would argue, from the sort of warrior type conception of manhood, where you're going out, or maybe herding is another model that people use. You're going out in order to come back and build. There's a much more conventional kind of sense that you earn money, you send it all home. Our children eat our money, those guys say. You send it home and then you come home. I suspect there's less that divorce is much more common in these kinds of situations. Men stop sending money home. There's nothing in it for them. In the old system, you sent money home because if you could support your children, then your sons would go to the mines, and you would end up being able to retire on the lobolo that you got for your daughters. It was the system that kind of worked. Now that system is gone. So that's that's essentially, I think, where the shift has taken place. The very meaning of the umzi has changed, I think. I remember one of the most powerful experiences that I ever had in my life, actually, was in the beginning of October. Out there, they put me to sleep in the flat. They slept in the rondels around. There was this huge noise, crowd, and shouting and singing, and at dawn. And I came out of my door and I looked, and across, on the hill across the way, there were a couple of old men with oxen and a plough, and they were ploughing the field across the way. And all the women and children from the village, or from the settlement, sort of scattered settlement, were following behind the plough, screaming and shouting and rejoicing. That's what's gone. People don't plough anymore. They still have cattle, they have kraals, they have gardens, and those old men who were ploughing were, I checked, they were not ploughing their land. They were ploughing someone else's land. With that kind of community is, I mean, there may be still scattered corners where Nombola traditionalist Amaqaba people live, and where this is still practiced, but they're not working on the mines as it is. There's wonderful work by Pat McAllister about the Sheprimi, I can't get the click. But they work at the fisheries because they're not stuck with the re-engagement certificate, the fixed holidays. They can choose when to come back from work and when to stay. And they work at the farms also in the Western Cape. But they seem to be able, at least through to where he finished his research in 2002, I think, up through that period, they were still doing ploughing. But in the areas in Wonderland where people are sent to the mines, there's next to no ploughing. So it's a shift. And ultimately, overall, this is a paternal conception of manhood. All of them. Whether the man in charge is gentle and benevolent and sort of trying to keep the peace and being helpful to everybody, he's still the man. There's one guy, let's see if I can find it. I'll finish. Here it is. There's this guy in Telezi that we spoke to, who was one of the people who insisted women could have ubudorda. Let me read the full a paragraph from. He says, we were talking about ubudorda, ubufazi, manhood and womanhood. These words mean the same. If you are a man, you can have ubufazi. If you are a woman, you can have ubudorda. He's the only guy who said a man could have ubufazi, except for talking about cowards. The difference is that if you are an indoda, if you're a man, if you have ubudorda, you have power. More power than ubufazi. Because this ubufazi comes from home where if ubudorda is being practiced, she must always listen. So this ubufazi is powerless, whereas ubudorda is powerful. That aspect is there. Right? The women with ubudorda have power. When the men come home, they lose their power. So patriarchal ideas. There's a tendency for people to talk about patriarchy as though it's a single thing. Patriarchy has all sorts of odd ways in which it works itself out. And in this case, that's what I've been talking about.
Well, what an excellent note. Thanks, Dunbar. That was an excellent note to end on, and I think that's, I mean, on the one hand, what you've given us is a really, interesting sort of series of in-depth pictures of your work and your understandings of shifting masculinities. But on the other, it's just simply opened up, especially with the questions and comments, it's opened up a whole series of questions around masculinity and around change and power and things that don't change. So I think there's a lot more work and a lot more thinking to take place around this. But thank you very much for opening it all up so well.
Thank you for the questions.
Let's go and have breakfast.